It must, therefore, in order to think itself clearly and distinctly, perceive itself under the form of this continuity. Concepts, in fact, are outside each other, like objects in space. They have the same stability as such objects, on which they have been modeled. Taken together, they constitute an intelligible world that resembles the world of solids in its essential characters, but whose elements are lighter, more diaphanous, easier for the intellect to deal with than the images of concrete things. They are not indeed the perception itself of things, but the representation of the act by which the intellect is fixed on them. They are therefore not images, but symbols. Our logic is a complete set of rules that must be followed in using symbols, as these symbols are derived from the consideration of solids. As the rules for combining these symbols hardly do more than express the most general relations among solids, our logic triumphs in that science which takes the solidity of bodies for its object, that is, in geometry. Logic and geometry engender each other, as we shall see a little further on. It is from the extension of a certain natural geometry, suggested by the most general and immediately perceived properties of solids, that natural logic has arisen. Then, from this natural logic, in its turn, has sprung scientific geometry, which extends further and further the knowledge of the external properties of solids. Geometry and logic are strictly applicable to matter. In it they are at home, and in it they can proceed quite alone. But outside this domain, pure reasoning needs to be supervised by common sense, which is an altogether different thing. Thus, all the elementary forces of the intellect tend to transform matter into an instrument of action, that is, in the etymological sense of the word, into an organ. Life, not content with producing organisms, would fain give them as an appendage inorganic matter itself, converted into an immense organ by the industry of the living being. Such is the initial task it assigns to intelligence. That is why the intellect always behaves as if it were fascinated by the contemplation of inert matter. It is life looking outward, putting itself outside itself, adopting the ways of unorganized nature and principle, in order to direct them in fact. Hence its bewilderment, when it turns to the living and is confronted with organization. It does what it can. It resolves the organized into the unorganized, for it cannot, without reversing its natural direction and twisting about on itself, think true continuity, real mobility, reciprocal penetration, in a word, that creative evolution which is life. Consider continuity, the aspect of life that is accessible to our intellect, as indeed to our senses, of which our intellect is an extension, is that which offers a hold to our action. Now, to modify an object, we have to perceive it as divisible and discontinuous. From the point of view of positive science, an incomparable progress was realized when the organized tissues were resolved into cells. The study of the cell, in its turn, has shown it to be an organism whose complexity seems to grow, the more thoroughly it is examined. The more science advances, the more it sees the number grow of heterogeneous elements which are placed together outside each other to make up a living being. Does science thus get any nearer to life? Does it not, on the contrary, find that what is really life in the living seems to recede with every step by which it pushes further the detail of the parts combined? There is indeed already among scientists a tendency to regard the substance of the organism as continuous, and the cell as an artificial entity. But supposing this view were finally to prevail, it could only lead, on deeper study, to some other mode of analyzing of the living being, and so to a new discontinuity, although less removed perhaps from the real continuity of life. The truth is that this continuity cannot be thought by the intellect. While it follows its natural movement, it implies at once the multiplicity of elements and the interpenetration of all by all, two conditions that can hardly be reconciled in the field in which our industry, and consequently our intellect, is engaged. Just as we separate in space, we fix in time. The intellect is not made to think evolution, in the proper sense of the word, that is to say, the continuity of a change that is pure mobility. We shall not dwell here on this point, which we propose to study in a special chapter. Suffice to say, that the intellect represents becoming as a series of states, each of which is homogeneous with itself and consequently does not change. Is our attention called to the internal change of one of these states? At once we decompose it into another series of states which, reunited, will be supposed to make up this internal modification. Each of these new states must be invariable, or else their internal change, if we are forced to notice it, must be resolved again into a fresh series of invariable states, and so on to infinity. Here again, thinking consists in reconstituting, and naturally it is with given elements, and consequently with stable elements that we reconstitute, so that, though we may do our best to imitate the mobility of becoming by an addition that is ever going on, becoming itself slips through our fingers just when we think we are holding it tight. Precisely because it is always trying to reconstitute, and to reconstitute with what is given, the intellect lets what is new in each moment of a history escape. It does not admit the unforeseeable. It rejects all creation. That definite antecedents bring forth a definite consequent, calculable as a function of them, is what satisfies our intellect. That a definite end calls forth definite means to attain it, is what we also understand. In both cases, we have to do with the known which is combined with the known, in short, with the old and which is repeated. Our intellect is there at ease, and whatever be the object, it will abstract, separate, eliminate. And so, so as to substitute for the object itself, if necessary, an approximate equivalent in which things will happen in this way, but that each instant is a fresh endowment, that the new is ever upspringing, that the form just come into existence, although where once produced it may be regarded as an effect determined by its causes, could never have been foreseen, because the causes here, unique in their kind, are part of the effect, have come into existence with it, and are determined by it as much as they determine it. All this we can feel within ourselves and also divine by sympathy outside ourselves, but we cannot think it, in the strict sense of the word, nor express it in terms of pure understanding. No wonder at that. We must remember what our intellect is meant for. The causality it seeks and finds everywhere expresses the very mechanism of our industry, in which we go on recomposing the same whole with the same parts, repeating the same movements to obtain the same result. The finality it understands best is the finality of our industry, in which we work on a model given in advance, that is to say, old or composed of elements already known. As to invention properly called, which is, however, the point of departure of industry itself, our intellect does not succeed in grasping it in its upspringing, that is to say, in its indivisibility, nor in its fervor, that is to say, in its creativeness. Explaining it always consisted in resolving it, in the unforeseeable and new, into elements old or known, arranged in a different order. The intellect can no more admit completely novelty than real becoming. That is to say, here, again, it lets an essential aspect of life escape, as if it were not intended to think such an object. All our analyses bring us to this conclusion. But it is hardly necessary to go into such long details concerning the mechanism of intellectual working. It is enough to consider the results. We see that the intellect, so skillful in dealing with the inert, is awkward the moment it touches the living. Whether it wants to treat the life of the body or the life of the mind, it proceeds with the rigor, the stiffness, and the brutality of an instrument not designed for such use. The history of hygiene or of pedagogy teaches us much in this matter, when we think of the cardinal, urgent, and constant need we have to preserve our bodies and to raise our souls, of the special facilities given to each of us in this field to experiment continually on ourselves and on others, of the palpable injury by which the wrongness of a medical or pedagogical practice is both made manifest and punished at once. We are amazed at the stupidity, and especially at the persistence of errors. We may easily find their origin in the natural obstinacy with which we treat the living like the lifeless, and think all reality, however fluid, under the form of the sharply defined solid. We are at ease only in the discontinuous, in the immobile, in the dead. The intellect is characterized by a natural inability to comprehend life.